The alleged gunman, U.S. Army Major Nidal Hasan, is in custody after a massacre left more than a dozen people at Fort Hood dead and injured more than 30.
On the afternoon of November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, Texas was going about its routine. One of the largest military installations in the world, Fort Hood functioned like a small city. Thousands of soldiers moving between buildings, administrative work being processed, and units preparing for upcoming deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. For most people on base that day, nothing felt unusual. It was another ordinary weekday in the middle of a long, exhausting war. By the end of the day, 13 people would be dead, more than 30 others wounded, and the United States Army would be forced to confront one of the most devastating internal failures in its modern history. The man responsible was Major Nidal Hasan, an active-duty U.S. Army psychiatrist. Hasan was not a combat soldier, he was a doctor. Born in the United States to Palestinian immigrant parents, he was academically gifted and followed a path that should have made him an asset to the military. He earned his degrees at Virginia Tech and later attended the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, a military medical school that trains doctors for service in the armed forces. On paper, Hasan was exactly what the Army needed during wartime, a trained psychiatrist willing to serve as deployments increased and mental health demands surged. But behind that professional image, his behavior had been raising alarms for years. As a psychiatrist, Hasan treated soldiers struggling with trauma from the wars overseas. He listened to stories of civilian casualties, moral conflict, and psychological damage. Instead of maintaining professional distance, he began to internalize what he heard. Colleagues noticed that his views were becoming increasingly extreme. He spoke frequently about religion, expressed admiration for martyrdom, and openly questioned whether Muslim soldiers should serve in the U.S. military at all. During official presentations, Hasan justified suicide bombings and compared American military actions to those of Nazi Germany. These statements were not whispered in private. They were delivered in classrooms, during briefings, and in uniform. Several officers were disturbed by his behavior, but rather than confront it directly, they chose a quieter path. Some feared accusations of religious discrimination, others worried about damaging their own careers. In the end, Hasan was allowed to progress through the system, his problems documented, but never decisively addressed. At the same time, Hasan had begun communicating with Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical cleric who was already under surveillance by U.S. intelligence agencies. The emails were reviewed by the FBI, but investigators concluded, incorrectly, that they were academic in nature and did not indicate a credible threat. No one connected Hasan's growing radicalization, his alarming workplace behavior, and his external communications into a single, coherent warning. In 2009, Hasan was transferred to Fort Hood, where he was scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan. For colleagues, the deployment was another concern. Hasan had openly stated that he opposed the wars and believed participating in them was morally wrong. Still, nothing was done to remove him from duty. On November 5th, Hasan entered the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, a building where soldiers prepared for deployment by completing medical evaluations and administrative paperwork. Inside were unarmed service members, many days away from leaving for a combat zone. Hasan was wearing his Army uniform. At approximately 1:34 in the afternoon, he opened fire. Within minutes, the room descended into chaos. Soldiers were shot at close range. Some attempted to flee, others crawled to safety, and a few tried to stop the attacker using whatever they could find. 13 people were killed. More than 30 were wounded before the attack was stopped. Civilian police officers assigned to the base responded quickly. Sergeant Kimberly Munley confronted Hasan and was shot multiple times, suffering severe injuries. Sergeant Mark Todd continued the engagement and shot Hasan, ending the attack. Fort Hood was immediately locked down. Emergency responders flooded the scene. Medical helicopters lifted the wounded to nearby hospitals. Across the country, families began receiving phone calls that would permanently alter their lives. In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. Army described the shooting as workplace violence. That decision would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Families of the victims argued that the attack was clearly motivated by ideology and terrorism, not personal grievance. The classification mattered. Labeling the attack as workplace violence denied victims certain benefits and recognition, including Purple Hearts. For years, families fought for acknowledgement. Eventually, after sustained pressure, the Army reversed its position and recognized the victims as casualties of terrorism. Hasan survived his injuries and was placed on trial in 2013. He showed no remorse and openly admitted responsibility. He stated that his actions were intended to defend fellow Muslims and that he believed the attack was justified. Hasan was convicted and sentenced to death. He remains on military death row. The Fort Hood shooting was not simply the result of one man's violence. It was the product of repeated institutional failures. Warning signs were observed, recorded, and discussed, but never acted upon decisively. Agencies worked in isolation. Responsibility was deferred. Intervention was avoided because it was uncomfortable. After Fort Hood, the U.S. military introduced reforms aimed at identifying insider threats and improving communication between agencies. Policies were adjusted, reporting mechanisms strengthened, and lessons formally documented. But those lessons came too late for the people who lost their lives. The victims of Fort Hood were not abstract numbers. They were soldiers, medics, clerks, and civilians, many preparing to deploy, others simply doing their jobs. Survivors carried physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. Families were left with grief, anger, and years of unanswered questions. Fort Hood stands as a stark reminder that not all threats come from outside the gate. Sometimes they come from within, hidden in plain sight, shielded by hesitation, bureaucracy, and the fear of making the wrong call. The tragedy was not that the warning signs were invisible. It was that they were seen and ignored. On the morning of November 5th, 2017, Sutherland Springs, Texas was doing what it had done for decades. It was quiet. The town sat along a narrow highway, surrounded by open land, modest homes, and a community that largely knew one another by name. Fewer than 700 people lived there. On Sundays, many of them gathered at the same place they always had, First Baptist Church. Inside, the church was small, plain wooden pews, white walls, no security, no guards, no reason to expect danger. At around 11:20 a.m., the service was underway, and then, without warning, the quiet ended. The attacker was Devin Patrick Kelly, a 26-year-old former U.S. Air Force member. On the surface, Kelly did not fit the stereotype many people imagine when they think of mass shooters. He was young, married, had served in the military. But beneath that surface was a long, documented history of violence. Years earlier, while stationed at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, Kelly had been court-martialed for brutally assaulting his wife and stepson. The abuse was severe, repeated, verified. In 2012, the U.S. Air Force convicted him of domestic violence, sentenced him to confinement, and discharged him for bad conduct. This conviction should have legally barred him from owning firearms, but it didn't. Due to a failure in reporting, the Air Force never forwarded his criminal record to the FBI's National Background Check database. That single omission would later carry devastating consequences. That Sunday morning, Kelly drove to the church and opened fire on the congregation. He targeted people he did not know, families, elderly churchgoers, children. By the time the violence ended, 26 people were dead, including 8 children. The youngest victim was 18 months old. The oldest was 77. It remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history, and the deadliest ever carried out at a church. The town of Sutherland Springs lost nearly 4% of its population in a matter of minutes. What stopped the attack was not police. It was a neighbor. Stephen Williford, a former NRA instructor, was at home nearby when he heard gunfire. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the sound. Williford confronted Kelly outside the church. The shooter fled the scene, eventually crashing his vehicle and dying from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Willeford did not chase glory. In interviews later, he emphasized one thing: "I did what anyone should do, protect people who can't protect themselves." But Sutherland Springs would never be the same. In the days that followed, the scale of the tragedy became clearer. Entire families had been wiped out. Parents buried children, grandparents buried grandchildren. The church itself became a crime scene, and later, a memorial. Services stopped. The building was eventually demolished. A new structure was built, but many residents never returned. Grief was not abstract here. It was personal, permanent, the institutional failure. As investigators dug deeper, attention shifted from the shooter to the system that failed to stop him. Kelly's domestic violence conviction legally disqualified him from purchasing firearms, yet he passed background checks multiple times. Why? Because the U.S. Air Force failed to report his conviction to the FBI. This was not a loophole. It was not a technicality. It was a breakdown in responsibility. In 2019, the Department of Defense admitted fault. Families of the victims sued the federal government, and won. The courts ruled that the Air Force's negligence directly enabled the massacre. The settlement exceeded $230 million, but no amount of money could undo what had happened. Sutherland Springs exposed something deeper than one violent man. It revealed a recurring pattern in mass violence. Documented warning signs, known history of abuse, institutional failure, missed opportunities to intervene. Domestic violence, in particular, stands out. Statistically, perpetrators of mass shootings are far more likely than average to have a history of domestic abuse. Yet those records are often fragmented, poorly shared, or ignored. Sutherland Springs was not unpredictable. It was preventable. When national attention moved on, Sutherland Springs remained. The town grew quieter. Some residents left. Others stayed, bound by memory. Every November, names are read aloud. Every pew left empty still tells a story. This was not a battlefield. It was not a war zone. It was a small church in a small town, and the people inside trusted that Sunday morning would be ordinary. Mass shootings are often discussed in numbers, body counts, timelines, statistics. But Sutherland Springs reminds us of something else. Systems fail, warnings are ignored, and the cost is paid by people who never had a choice.